So hello everybody. I think it's 2 and we shall start with our first webinar. And although not all the registered people are present at the moment, I think to be in time, we start now. And so first of all, I would like to welcome you to our first webinar of our new EU-funded project S3martMed. My name is Clara Altin-Toprak from Bioregio Stern in Baden-Württemberg, Germany, and I moderate the session today. Before we start the webinar, I would like to outline some rules. And first of all, I ask you to switch off your camera and your microphone so that we have no background noise. And during the whole webinar, only the speaker is allowed to talk. Further, we have the possibility to ask questions via the chat function during the presentation. So if you have questions on this topic, please don't hesitate, and we will read this question at the end. So if you cannot hear the speaker, please inform us via the chat function, or alternatively, you can also use the dial number. So you have, each country has its own number. You have here an example how to, the number and the access code. So then I want to highlight that we want to improve our support in the future. And for that, we send you a link in the first email for the invitation for this webinar. And we want to ask you if you can participate in this survey. And I will send you again the link after the webinar. So that would be great for us. Now we come to our webinar content about the key facts of the new European MDR. We start with a short introduction of the S3martMed project, and this will be given by Emilie Romeo from Lyon Biopol, which is the lead partner of this project. Subsequently, Martin Witte, the Global Director of Active Medical Implants from TÜV Süd Product Service in Germany, will give the presentation of the main topic, key facts on the new MDR. And at the end, I will read out the questions you have asked, and they will then be answered. So I give the, Emilie, you can start with the introduction into the S3martMed project.
So the S3martMed project, in brief, this is a new European project funded by the COSME program, which is dedicated to SME support, and it is funded until October 2020. So the 5 partners involved in the project are cluster organizations that are supporting SMEs and research centers in their region. So in partners we have Lyon Biopol based in Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes, WEBINAIRE in Piedmont, VIII in Wallonia, Bioregio Stern from Baden-Württemberg, and Med Silesia based in Poland, Upper Silesia. So our ambition is to support and to encourage scientific and business collaboration between the different players that are located in our region. And in particular, we have a focus on SMEs and collaboration with RTOs, so Research Technological Organization. So yeah, we want to stimulate the exchange and build collaboration thanks to different activity we are going to organize that I will show you just after. And also we would like to support emerging projects by define together funding scheme and also having the regional support from our regional authority. So it will be a second step in the project. So as I said, in order to stimulate exchange, the SmartMed partners are going to organize different networking activities. So there will be webinars like the one we have today. There will be 2 other webinars until July, presenting some collaborative project and successful story between our region. Then we, apparently there's an echo, but all the microphones are off, so I hope the sound is okay. So we are going also to have moments face-to-face meetings. So there will be 2 regional networking events organized in the project lifetime. So there will be one. The first one will be in September on 19 and 20 in Stuttgart. So if you are interested, we will send you further information. And there will be also we give you the occasion to meet all the project partners at Medinov in April in Lyon. We will have a booth where you can meet the different cluster organizations. So the final activity will be to support once again the different collaboration that will emerge from our SmartMed project, thanks to different advisory activity and also with the support of our regional authority. So that was a short introduction, but then if you need information, don't hesitate. You can find in the last slide all the local, if I can say, all the contact of in your local cluster. So don't hesitate to get back to us. And again, as Clara said, it's great if you are also willing to participate in our survey. So now I will give the floor to Mr. VIII, and I thank you him in advance for his presentation. Okay.
So good afternoon, everybody. So this will be now a 45-minute presentation on the medical device regulation and some key facts. As you might imagine, it's not possible to go through the MDR within 45 minutes. So I focus on some highlights and will only focus on certain topics. So I think it is a very, very important thing to have not only read the MDR once, but several times to really understand what is in there. People who have not read, or companies or organizations who have not yet read the MDR or only have read it once, I would say hurry up because it's getting late now. So a few words to me. So I am responsible for a global team in TÜV Süd that is dealing with active implantable devices, as Clara already said. So I'm with the organization since 2014, and I had previous roles as lead auditor, product specialist, and a regulatory affairs manager in Biotronic, which is a pacemaker manufacturer in Berlin. So we deal with global clients from all over the world and are located in Munich. And our main business is product assessment and auditing. So the main topics we will go through today is the history and the background of the MDR. Then we will go through the classification, conformity assessment procedures, clinical data, technical documentation, and then a short overview on the economic operators. So why is there actually a new medical device regulation? So in 2008, the Commission had a consultation on a medical device framework renewal. So in that time, there were some medical devices failing, even though they were CE marked. And that also happened to high-risk products. And soon later in time, things happened like the PIP scandal. So basically, the public interest and the media was not really supporting medical device regulation and medical device companies. So as a politician, you only have one thing to do, because as a politician, your product is a law. So what you do is you create a new regulation. It then took a while until the new regulation was released. But in 2017, the MDR was published on May 5th. So this provides us with a 3-year transition time. And as of May 26, 2020, we will be working under the MDR only. So besides the MDR, there are also some other elements that need to be taken into consideration. Those are delegating acts, implementing acts, common specification, harmonized standards that we already know. So harmonized standards from MDDA and MDD are present. If they will be harmonized under the MDR is a completely different discussion. And there will be MEDDEV and CAMD documents or guidance documents. All these elements are not yet really set in place and are still under development by the Commission. And therefore, it's very important for you to follow what the Commission publishes on their website. So what are the main changes and improvements, if you want to call it improvements, in the MDR compared to the MDDA or MDD? So if we narrow it down to 7 most important modifications, then we have a much stricter pre-market control. So to bring a product onto the market is getting more difficult. There is a better oversight or a more thorough oversight on notified bodies. So currently we have quite a number of notified bodies that will reduce under the MDR, because every notified body has to go through an audit session with the Commission and with other parties. So the scrutiny on notified body increases. Then we have the inclusion of products without medical purpose. And we will have an EU database, we will have an implant card, and we will have much stricter rules on clinical data and clinical investigation. And there will be much more data about real-life use of the device, so post-approval data and market data. So the timelines in a graphic look like this. So we are now in 2019, as you can see here. And we will soon see the first numbers of designation. We are aware of the fact that BSI UK has been designated so far. TÜV is looking forward for a designation soon, and there will be other notified bodies to be designated soon. The 3-year transition time will end with May 2020, and certificates that are currently valid under the MDDA or MDDD will remain valid, but not later than 2024. And then there are other things that medical device manufacturers have to take into consideration, as the 13485 grace period, the MD sub period. So there is a lot of things approaching medical device manufacturers. The structure of the MDR is pretty common. You will have scope and definitions in the beginning, and then it's structured into 10 sections, chapters, which focus on certain topics. In addition to the general law text, so to say, you will find a lot of annexes. It was always common that the Annex I of an EU regulation or an EU directive is bringing something like the essential requirements, or now under the MDR, the general safety and performance requirements. And then you will find other annexes through which we will go through during this presentation. So classification of medical devices is something you need to do first. So that's illustrated in Chapter 5 as well as in Annex 8. So the classification of medical devices is still something that has not changed too much, except for some rules that have changed and that now come up with a higher classification of the device. So under the MDD, we had 18 rules to follow. And under the AIMDD, we had no rule to follow because all AIMDDs were high-risk products. Therefore, there was no classification in the AIMDD. Now we have 22 rules under the MDR, and they are all covered in Annex VIII. So first of all, it's of course very important that you go through Annex VIII from the beginning on, because there are some definitions that you need to take into consideration. So I will highlight some things that are important from Annex VIII. That is that the classification is the responsibility of the manufacturer. It is not the responsibility of the notified body. A notified body is there to challenge the classification the manufacturer did. And if there is a dispute, but we'll come to that later, then notified body, authority, and manufacturer need to come to an agreement through a certain process, but we'll come to that later. You should also check if your current classifications remain applicable, because there will be a lot of up-classifications. There might be some classifications that will be lower than under the current legislation, but mainly what we will see is that a lot of products, specifically in class 2AB, will be classified as class 3 or as class 2B implantables, which is more or less pseudo class 3. And then again, the dispute between notified body and manufacturers, that's something that is covered in Article 51 of the MDR. So as I said, there are some definitions, and I put some definitions on this slide, but I will not go through all these definitions. But for example, the use time of a device, if it's transient, short-term, or long-term, is something that is very important. Also, the definition of a central circulatory system, a central nervous system, and accessory of a medical device. So a lot of manufacturers talk about accessories when they talk about actual medical devices. So an accessory is not itself a medical device. That's very important. And that's something you need to take into consideration. And when you classify something like that, then it is classified in its own right. So there is a lot of information in this annex that needs to be carefully evaluated and used for your decision on classifying your device. So basically, the structure of Annex VIII is known from the current regulations. So we have Rule 124 for non-invasive devices. We have Rule 528 for invasive devices. Then we have the Rules 9 to 13 for active devices. And we will have the special rules for special devices, which is Rule 14 to 22. What you typically do is, if you have your medical device, you have an intended purpose of your medical device. So with this intended purpose, you can go through the rules 1 to 22, and wherever you end up in the classification, that's your device. So this can be taken as a flowchart, and I've seen some flowcharts out there that can be used to classify your device. Now I will go into some changes in terms of comparison MDD to MDR. So for non-invasive devices, we now have a slightly different rules, but basically there is no big change in classification of non-invasive devices. We now have a coverage of in vitro fertilization devices, as well as tissue engineering devices as class 3 devices, which is new. In terms of invasive devices, we have specifically for use in contact with heart or central circulatory system, we always end up in class 3, which of course is understandable, because if you touch the heart or the central circulatory system, your device poses a high risk to the patient. Therefore, devices are now classified as class 3 devices. Then there is active implantable devices, which were up until now under the AIMDD. They are now under class 3 in the MDR. And we will have a class 3 classification for all total or partial joint replacement, spinal disc replacement, and implantable devices in contact with the spinal column. All joints. Also a joint that is only in your fingers or in your small finger. That is a total joint replacement. It's there for a certain while, which is years, decades, and therefore it's a class 3 device. That is something that is new. It's not only focusing on hip or knee replacements. Then we have some changes on active devices. So active devices for controlling, monitoring, or influencing active implantable devices are class 3. That is something that is not new, but it is new, of course, in the MDR, because the MDR now covers these devices as well. And software as an active device can be classified between class 1 and class 3, depending on its individual risk. And on software, there is a lot of discussion still ongoing. So software is a pretty difficult topic to make a judgment right now if software is really in class 1 or class 3. So here it's extremely important that you exchange with a notified body, or that you also are involved in publications or follow publications around the software classification under the MDR. And that, as I said in the beginning, if there is a dispute between the notified body and the manufacturer, then it needs to follow a certain process. And the process is that the place where the manufacturer has their registered place of business, so let's say that's Germany, and you do a classification as a German manufacturer, and your notified body is also in Germany, and you have a dispute in terms of the classification of your device, then that will be addressed to the competent authority of the manufacturer's member state. So this is pretty simple. In such a case, it would be Germany. If a competent authority is involved, then when, as I said, the notified body is in the same member state as the manufacturer, then the decision is made by the competent authority of that member state, and the notification goes to the medical device expert group. If the notified body is in a different member state, so let's say the manufacturer is in France and the notified body is in Germany, then there is a consultation with the competent authority of the member state that designated the notified body, but also the competent authority of the manufacturer is involved. And if they all agree, then we'll have a notification on the medical device expert group. So now when we made our classification, we can choose our conformity assessment procedure. And you can only choose your conformity assessment procedure after you did your classification, because the conformity assessment procedure relies on your classification. So chapters that are relevant for the conformity assessment procedure is chapter 5 and chapter 4. So the notified bodies chapter, because in our chapter it's described what we need to do. And then there is a lot of chapters that are involved or affected by the conformity assessment procedures. And you might have seen the next slide for MDD classifications and MDD conformity assessment procedures. So what you basically always need is a general safety and performance requirements information. So you always need to fulfill Annex I, always. You always need to have Annex II, a technical documentation. For each and every device, you need to have those two. But now it depends on the classification of your device, which route you will take. So you can, if you have a class 1 device, you can go with these two through to the declaration of conformity. I will go through that later. If you want to do testing with a notified body, so do type examination, then that's possible for class 3 to be implantable, and then you go through Annex 10 type examination. And depending on the risk class, you also need to take into consideration Annex 10.6, which is special procedures. And they are applicable, as I said here, for implantable devices and devices with incorporated medicinal products or class 3 utilizing tissue or cells. So there are special procedures that you need to follow. Otherwise, you can go through the product qualification assurance or through product verification. Now, if you have a class 1 with is sterile has measuring function or is a reusable surgical instrument, or you have class 2B or your class 2A, you go through this. That is the typical quality management system certification without chapter 2. That means you will have a review of your technical documentation on the sampling basis. If you have a high-risk product or to be implantable product, you need to go through a quality management system certification and an assessment of each technical documentation. So as I said earlier, class 2B implantable becomes something like a pseudo class 3, because today the class 2B implantable goes through the normal class 2B process, but now in future, as it is an implantable, it follows the same process as a class 3. It's just called class 2B. I would say this is some political buy-off. Otherwise, I wouldn't understand why this is two different classifications. So, and depending on the device, again, special procedures might apply. And if you have the two certificates in place and also follow the special procedures, you will have the right to create a declaration of conformity. So I picked out this one example because it's very important for a lot of manufacturers. Because class 1 devices, they will not have a transition period because they don't have a certificate under MDD, because under IAMDD there is no class 1. So you don't have a certificate for a class 1 device under MDD. So for class 1 devices, there is no transition time. So you need to be compliant as of the first day of application of the MDR, which is May 2020. So you yourself have to do a product assessment, which means that your general safety and performance requirements according to Annex I need to be fulfilled, and you have to have documented evidence in place. That is typically the technical documentation, so something in accordance with Annex II. And then you can prepare a declaration of conformity and, if necessary, translations of that. And then you can sign the declaration of conformity. And from a conformity assessment procedure, that's it. I don't say that's it in terms of registering the device, because that's something that needs to be done under WEBINAIRE, which is not yet in place and where we don't yet know how this will be handled in future. We can only say that if WEBINAIRE is in place and we know how to register these devices. What you of course can do is ask your competent authority what to do with a class 1 device, because basically you could register a class 1 device by law as of today. But as far as I know, no competent authority is able to support this. So when we talk about class 1 sterile devices, measurement functional devices, and reusable surgical instruments, then there is the two options that I highlighted earlier. So you can go through Annex 9 without Chapter 2. And you can go through Annex II, which is type testing with Part A of Annex 11. So what will we do as a notified body in such a situation? Because it's a class 1 device, we will only focus on the special characteristic of this device. So when it's sterile, then we would look for the sterilization process and the sterilization conditions. If it has measurement functionality, then we would focus on metrological requirements. And if it's about reusable surgical instruments, we look at cleaning, disinfection, sterilization, maintenance, and functional testing and the related instruction for use of that device. And also to highlight some of the special procedures. So there are additional procedures in accordance with Article 52, 53, 54, Annex 9, and Annex 10. So for example, for class 3 implantable devices and for class 2B, that is Rule 12, we will need to go through a clinical evaluation consultation procedure, which means if the notified body has evaluated clinical evaluation of the manufacturer, then the assessment result of the notified body needs to be forwarded to the medical device expert group, and they also have to evaluate this, but we come to that later. The same is true for devices that administer or remove a medicinal substance from the body. With medicinal substances, we have to consult with a competent authority or the European Medicinal Agency. The topic here is still under heavy discussion if consultations that have been performed under MDD can also be used under MDR. So this is something where, as to my knowledge, not yet a final decision has been made. You also have to go through consultation for specific substances from human blood and plasma. So tissue, cells, and animal human origin used in your device, you have to go through a consultation. And if your device systematically absorbed to achieve intended purpose, which means its intended purpose is actually achieved by being absorbed, then you also have to go through a consultation with a competent authority. I think the most critical topic under the MDR will be the clinical data and the clinical evaluation. So 50% of the MDR is talking about clinical, which means that clinical might not have had the focus under the MDD, AIMDD that it will have now. So that's also very well illustrated by what is a clinical evaluation. So the MDD in the beginning didn't have a specific definition of a clinical evaluation. So what was done? A METAF document was created. So the METAF document became bigger and bigger and bigger and more detailed than the MDD at all, which is pretty interesting because they are only focusing on the one clinical aspect, the 271. And the METDEF has more content than the whole MDD in its revision 4. So now in the MDR, we have a definition that the clinical evaluation is a systematic and planned process to continuously generate, collect, analyze, and assess the clinical data pertaining to a device in order to verify the safety and performance. Okay, there is a lot of words in here. It's a planned process and it's continuous and it collects and analyzes. Okay, so the manufacturer shall specify and justify the level of clinical evidence necessary to demonstrate compliance with the relevant essential requirements on safety and performance, which is a link to Annex I. So it's the responsibility of the manufacturer to specify and justify the level of clinical evidence necessary to demonstrate compliance. Our job as a notified body is to assess that and to challenge that. So the clinical evaluation principles and sources of data, that's something that is highlighted in Article 61. So the clinical evaluation in accordance with Annex 14 is thorough and objective and takes into account favorable and unfavorable data. So if you have clinical data about your device that is unfavorable, you have to take it into consideration, and it will be part of your clinical evaluation. It is an in-depth and extent shall be proportionate and appropriate to the nature and classification intended purpose and risk of the device in question. Proportionate and appropriate. These are all pretty vague terms, but it leaves the manufacturer the possibility to decide on what is proportionate and appropriate. Of course, that is also a risk because if a notified body sees this completely different, then we have a challenge to get both understandings in agreement, and this might be the biggest challenge for the future. And it might be that your clinical data is based on equivalence. So if there is equivalence-based data, then it will come up with some extra requirements, which we will go through later. So the sources of clinical data is scientific literature still. So if you do a proper scientific literature search that you have to do, you will have one source of clinical data. Then another source of clinical data is your clinical investigations and a critical evaluation of those. Then the considerations of currently available alternative treatment options. So if you have a device that treats something that is also treated by different alternative options like medicinal options or other devices, then it's something that you have to take into consideration. So coming back to the topic of equivalence, equivalence is something that will be very, very difficult under the MDR. So I am aware of the fact that a lot of devices are currently on the market that follow the equivalence approach. But what is equivalence actually? Equivalence was now redefined in METAF 271 revision 4, and I think under the revision 4 it's already very, very difficult to find a really equivalent device, because it has to have on technical, biological, and clinical aspects, and similar design, similar conditions, same materials, same clinical conditions, same kind of user, similar kind and duration of contact. So all these elements here must be fulfilled to really talk about equivalency. And if you are in a certain classification of devices, then you are forced to actually have a clinical investigation in order to support your clinical evaluation. So for example, here it states that for a class 3 device, clinical data should, as a general rule, be sourced from clinical investigations, with the exception of devices that have been designed by modification of a device already marketed, by devices that are equivalent to devices already on the market. Okay, here we have the term equivalent again, and by devices approved under the MDD or AMDD. Okay, so when we say that for implantable devices in class 3, clinical investigation is exempt, if from modification, then that device needs to be by the same manufacturer, it needs to be equivalent, and it needs to have sufficiently demonstrated conformity of the modified device with the general safety and performance requirements. So, and in such a case, the notified body shall check that the post-market clinical follow-up plan is appropriate and includes post-market studies, which is then again a clinical study to demonstrate the safety and performance of the device. So this post-market clinical follow-up plan becomes a requirement for devices. And if you have a device that has been designed on modifications of an already existing device, you can actually receive a CE mark without a new clinical study prior to market approval, but based on your post-market clinical follow-up plan and your post-market study, you will, of course, have to collect actively some clinical data. So, and if you are able to demonstrate equivalency, then the data from equivalent device can be leveraged if a manufacturer has full access to the technical documentation of the marketed device to which they claim equivalency. So if you claim equivalency to a competitor, you will not have a full access to the technical documentation of that competitor. You will not be able to claim equivalency because you don't know anything or everything about the device. You only know a little portion of what the actual manufacturer knows about their device, because you don't have access to the technical documentation, and therefore the equivalent approach is more or less gone under the MDR. So, and for devices that have already been approved under MDD, AIMDD, for example, for in this case, implantable and class 3 devices, a clinical investigation is exempt if device is lawfully marketed under MDD or AIMDD, has sufficient clinical data. Okay, what does that mean? Sufficient is, of course, not defined because it's depending on the device. And the clinical evaluation of the marketed device is in compliance with the relevant common specifications if available. So if there are common specifications, then the device has to be, the clinical evaluation of that device has to be in compliance with the common specification. There is also another rule that no need for clinical investigation for sutures, dental fillings, dental braces, screws, plates, clips, etc. So in general, the whole clinical topic we just talked about covers the clinical evaluation report, which is the result of a clinical evaluation plan. So as another element, you will have a literature search plan that will reside in a literature search report. Your clinical evaluation report will become a part or will be an input for your summary on safety and clinical performance that you have to prepare depending on your risk classification. Then you will have a post-market clinical follow-up plan that you have to define for a device, and you have a post-market clinical follow-up report, which will also be part of your summary on safety and clinical performance, and also feeds into your clinical evaluation report because it will be requested from your clinical evaluation plan to collect this data. Post-market surveillance is something that you actively have to do, so you have to have a post-market surveillance plan, and depending on the risk classification of the device, you will have a post-market surveillance report, or you will have a periodic safety update report, which also will have influence on your clinical evaluation, your summary on safety and clinical performance, and will therefore be requested from your clinical evaluation plan as an input. And if you have vigilance, of course, ongoing, then you might have incidents and trends. So it's not only about, I write a clinical evaluation report and I'm fine. You have to modify your whole quality management system in order to collect, document, plan all sources of data that you can get information out about your device, because that is extremely important for the future. And that brings us now to the technical documentation, because the clinical information is also part of the technical documentation, but there is a lot of other stuff that needs to be in your technical documentation. So your technical documentation is defined under Chapter 2. So the requirement of having one comes from Chapter 2 of the Medical Device Regulation and is now highlighted in Annex II and Annex III, and that is something that is better than under the current legislation, because today we don't have proper definition of what is a technical documentation and what needs to go into a technical documentation. So by this, we now have a proper definition by following this Annex II and Annex III. So Article 4 requires that a manufacturer of a device, other than a custom-made device, shall draw up and keep up to date a technical documentation for the device. Okay, good. And the technical documentation must include the elements set out in Annex 2 and Annex 3. Good. So then there is Article 8, and Article 8 requires the manufacturer to keep the technical documentation, the EU Declaration of Conformity, and if applicable, a copy of any relevant certificate available for the competent authorities for a period of at least 10 years after the last device covered by the EU Declaration of Conformity has been placed on the market. In case of implantable devices, the period shall be at least 15 years. So that is something where you have to make sure that you have document retention in place covering these requirements. And of course, you have to have the technical documentation available for the competent authority. So they might ask for it. Annex 2 has a very interesting introduction, and the introduction states that the technical documentation and, if applicable, the summary thereof. Nobody knows what the summary thereof is. The summary thereof might be something that might come from an authority asking you as a manufacturer to provide you a summary of a specific aspect of your technical documentation, but this is not further defined somewhere in the MDR, to be drawn up by the manufacturer and shall be presented in a clear, organized, readily searchable, and unambiguous manner, and shall include, in particular, the elements listed in this annex. So I think these words are pretty interesting because it needs to be organized, readily searchable, unambiguous, and clear. Good. So there are, in Annex 2, there are 6 sections. First of all, a technical documentation shall, I think it makes absolutely sense how the Annex 2 is set up. So first of all, it requires a device description. So the device description is, of course, very important for a notified body or for a competent authority to understand what the device is. So it is something like the introduction to the device and what this documentation is covering. So, of course, that includes the intended purpose of the device. It includes the target group. So you now have to define who is the intended user and who is the intended patient population for which this device was designed. And this is a very, very interesting and important information also in the beginning of reading through a technical documentation, because it, of course, influences your risk management and also influences your general safety and performance requirements. So if we have now the device description covered, then we talk about the information supplied by the manufacturer, which is typically labels and instruction for use. And what the MDR requires here is a complete set of labels on the device and packaging in the language accepted in the member states where the device is envisaged to be sold. So this is a clear requirement that if you plan to market your device all over Europe, that you have to comply to the language requirements of all member states all over Europe, and that this needs to be part of your technical documentation. Then we have a lot of design and manufacturing information, which we didn't have in that detail before. So the third section of this annex requires a lot of information here, information allowing the design stages to be understood, for example, and also supplier information is becoming very important. Then we have the general safety and performance requirements, which is the new term for the essential requirements. This is pretty straightforward. So if you fulfill the Annex I, then you have to show compliance to each requirement of the Annex I by evidence, typically a report, and that is information you might provide here. Then there need to be a benefit risk analysis and risk management, which is also nothing new. So risk management is not really affected by the MDR because it's already there. Product verification and validation is also a very important element. And what you might wonder is, where do I have all this information? And the point is, you have all this information. You have all this information in databases, in Excel files, in SharePoint, in SAP, Oracle, whatever you use. You typically have all this information. The huge challenge you will face is to collect all this information, to combine all this information, and to keep track on changes of this information. And that is also the reason why I think that this is how a typical technical documentation looks like, especially if you have a company that has more than 2 devices, because or maybe 3, I don't know. But if you have a huge amount of devices, then it's more or less impossible to have everything on paper. So this is something where you really have to dig into your plans, and you have to make your decisions on what do you need, how do you need to restructure your quality management system, do you need to have new software, where do you have all this information and data, because you have to provide it to competent authorities, or in terms of technical documentation assessment, also to competent to notified bodies. And if you have to do so, the documentation needs to be provided in a clear and organized manner. So the last topic we will cover is the economic operators. So there is this new term of economic operators, and that's in Article 2 of the MDR. And we have manufacturers, authorized representative distributors, and importers. But there is also the person that puts together systems or procedure packs, according to Article 22, and the person that sterilizes systems or procedure packs, according to Article 22, third point. So what is a manufacturer? A manufacturer is a natural or legal person who manufactures or fully refurbishes a device designed, manufactured or fully refurbished, and markets that device under his name or trade name. Okay, what does fully refurbish mean? A complete rebuild of a device already placed on the market or put into service, or the making of a new device from used devices. Okay, if you do that, you become a manufacturer. Manufacturers need to have a person responsible for regulatory compliance. That's a new role. You need to have this person. You will maybe have challenges to find that. If you are a small company, you can have an external person. Large firms must have this person available in the organization. Others need to have them permanently available. So that might be something where we will ask a service provider to provide you with a person responsible for regulatory compliance if you are a small manufacturer. So the definition of an authorized representative is authorized representative within the union who has received and accepted a written mandate from a manufacturer outside the European Union. European Union means European Union, and the European Union is not Switzerland. So there are discussions ongoing and there are still negotiations, but there has not yet been signed anything. So Switzerland is not part of the European Union. Therefore, if you are in Switzerland and you are a manufacturer, you might have to have an authorized representative. But I know that there are discussions ongoing between the Swiss and the European government, so to say. Then there is the single authorized representatives. They also need to have legal resources. They are responsible for defective devices. They have to keep available a copy of the technical documentation. So remember what I said, if your technical documentation is not electronic, then you have to give them a technical documentation in paper and need to keep it updated all the time. That is also a huge challenge. And in addition to that, the single authorized representative also has to have permanently and continuously at their disposal at least one regulatory responsible person. Now, there is also the term of distributor. So the distributor, other than the manufacturer or the importer, makes the device available. Okay, that's easy. That's maybe the last step in the supply chain. But it also talks about importer. So the importer is a natural or legal person established also in the union who places a device from a third country on the union market. Remember what I said, union is European Union. Also taking into account Brexit and maybe no deal Brexits, this all might affect manufacturers that are not located in the EU. So that's something that you also need to be very careful about and need to consider all aspects of what a importer does and what the responsibilities of an importer are and where this importer is actually located. So, and I think now the time is up, and I thank you for your patience and for your listening and viewing, and I think we have some minutes for questions now.
So thank you, Martin, for this overview that you give about the MDR. And I hope you attendees have got a basic insight into the MDR and also how to schedule the evaluation and certification of your medical devices on the level of the European MDR. As I can see so far, there are no questions in the chat, so I will give you a last chance to ask your questions.
Yes, Clara, I think it's Emily speaking. There was one question. I just sent it to you in the chat. Do you see it?
No.
Okay.
Can you read it, please?
Yeah. So the question was on pre-market clinical trial. Should those trials be randomized trials, or are single-arm cohort study acceptable?
So it's very, very difficult to make general statements on clinical data and how to collect it. It's always a definition. It's always a question about the device. It's always a question about its intended purpose, its risk classification and all that. So it needs to be proportionate and appropriate. And I can't give a more detailed answer to that. So it's very important that when you have your intended purpose for your device and you have a clinical study plan, then try to get clarity on the regulatory requirements to your clinical strategy by either contacting competent authorities, notified bodies, or good consultants.
So, Emily, that was the only question.
Yes, right.
Yes.
And just
Okay.
one person asked for the slides. So yeah, you will have the record of the presentation of this webinar available just after the session.
Okay, then I will thank you all the participants and the speaker again, and wish you a nice day, and we hope that you will join our next webinars in May and July. So I say goodbye to you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.